It's a real axial age. And I'm hopeful. And I think on the other side of this axial age is a culture of life. But the scramble is now. I think if I could take a time machine to any point in the history of the human family, it would be to right now. Because I think there's never been more at stake.
Hey, welcome back everyone. We're sitting here with Jason Jones, founder of Movie to Movement, talking about responsible business when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, when it comes to the human rights abuses in the world, and how we should view these things. Jason Jones, it's a real pleasure having you on Crossroads.
A privilege to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we actually spoke to you briefly during the event yesterday, in fact. We're here in Washington. I spoke with you briefly at the event, calling on the Chinese Communist Party to be designated a transnational criminal organization. And of course, you were speaking out about human rights around the world and some of the religious persecutions happening right now in China. And of course, we're still in the middle of this election. There's legal challenges, things are still ongoing. I guess for you, what made you want to come out and speak when it came to religious liberty in China in relation, again, to the elections?
Well, words mean things, you know. Words are powerful. And the last thing I would want to do is speak calumny. If I say something, I believe it. China, the CCP is a transnational criminal organization. But that's not the main reason I left my family and flew to Washington, D.C. this week. The reason I came to Washington, D.C. was not because of the crimes of the CCP against the Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minorities, but the participation of American corporations, and as a Catholic, the failure of my church leadership to call them out. It says in Luke that even the stones will cry out if you don't speak out. And so my bishops aren't speaking out. Pope Francis has been silent. I'll be a stone. As a filmmaker who's Catholic, I wanted to be here to stand. I think as a Christian, and we're coming up on the Christmas season, what it is to be a Christian, as Jimmy Lai said recently in a video I saw in the Wall Street Journal, is to stand with the vulnerable. And that's what I want to do. I've been just so blessed, and I'm addled at the thought that American corporations like Coca-Cola, like Costco, like Nike, like Apple are profiting off of slave labor, which means I'm benefiting from slave labor, my family, my friends, my neighbors, my country. And that's sorrowful. But even more sorrowful to me is that my church has been silent. Our leadership has been silent, especially in the light of the secret Vatican deal with China that was brokered by, now we know, a predator, Cardinal McCarrick. So I think that it's very important as a Catholic layman to be here, to call on my church to speak out, and also as an American to call on our corporations to, instead of lobby, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to gut the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. They should be the ones leading the charge so that they can certify, they can comfort the consumer that, listen, you're hearing these things, but we want to make sure that none of our products are made by forced labor. Rather than working with members of Congress to get a good bill, they're working to gut the bill. And so that's why I was here.
And in China right now, there have been these different sanctions on Chinese Communist Party officials and on Chinese businesses that have been directly involved with slave labor, for example, in Xinjiang. There have been other sanctions happening as well in China against, for example, in Hong Kong, against persecution of Falun Gong, people involved in that, getting sanctioned for what they're doing. And as you mentioned, a lot of Western businesses have been involved in those industries as well that have been tied to these abuses. Now, it's an interesting point, and one that often we don't think about, is that yes, you have the abuses taking place in countries like China, but then you also have a lot of times Western finance, Western business, and the banking system directly supporting it. And these guys rarely get called out for it. Now, I know you have this, of course, company or nonprofit, Movie to Movement, which kind of talks about the merging of values with business. And I'm curious what your stance is on kind of merging those two.
Film and values. Our mission is very simple at Movie to Movement. It's to protect the vulnerable from violence, and we do that by telling the truth about the human person, that the human person has an incomparable beauty and worth, and then to inspire solidarity with the vulnerable, from the child in the womb, to the Yazidi girl in Mount Sinjar, to the Falun Gong, to the activists in Hong Kong, to the Uyghur. And there's no better way. I started knocking on doors as a 17-year-old boy on human rights issues. And then I got a radio show, and I always thought, what's the best way to reach the most people? I learned telling stories is the best way to inspire solidarity. What's the most powerful way to tell a story? Well, for my generation, it's movies. Maybe if I was young, I'd be an Instagram influencer or something. But for me, it was, I want to make movies. And I've been blessed that our films, they're Hollywood, very successsful. I've probably won over 50 major Hollywood films. People think of me probably more as a movie producer, but I'm really a human rights activist. I write, I'm an author, I have a podcast. Film is just, to me, the most effective way to tell the truth through stories. And, the human person is every human being, each and every human being is the most precious thing, created thing in the cosmos. And the idea of millions of people suffering violence, being separated from their families, being murdered, having their organs harvested, it's unimaginable and it's unthinkable. The CCP lies. It's a regime of lies. It's an ideology of lies. And the most fundamental lie of the CCP is it denies the beauty of the human person. So how do I punch above my weight as an independent filmmaker running a human rights organization? I'll making movies. That's the best way. And as you know, cameras frighten dictators. Nothing is more frightening to a thug than a camera. And we use cameras to tell stories through narrative films and documentaries.
Now, I think you're hitting on something interesting here because, of course, you're very strong in your own faith, but you do a lot to defend the faith of others. Now, why is that? How do you view this?
I started this mission as an atheist. As a 17-year-old, I lost my first child to violence, a forced abortion. My high school girlfriend had a forced abortion while I was at basic training. Her father took her to get a forced abortion. I was raised with no religion. That experience in the film business, or you're writing a script, that would be called my inciting incident, my call to adventure. That was a great injustice that happened to me. That injustice, even though I was an atheist raised with no religious tradition, that injustice taught me the truth about the human person. And that's why yesterday you saw the Uyghur and you saw Buddhists and you saw Falun Gong and you saw all these people. What they shared in common is empathy that was birthed through pain. And when you suffer, you like so profoundly, the idea that others are suffering like this is unbearable. You don't ask what their religion is. You don't ask what their political identification is. I don't ask them what their pronouns are. None of this matters to me. Because regardless of what they think about themselves, my faith confirms what to me, even as an atheist, was self-evident. That human beings are precious. And that every human being deserves to live free from coercion, to live free from violence. And I think, as C.S. Lewis wrote in his great book, The Abolition of Man, that he called it the Tao, I think that it is so obvious, and all the great religious traditions acknowledge that truth, and all the ideologies of evil that have ravaged the world for the past century deny that truth. So yesterday you see all these religious traditions together, and what we were standing up against were these ideologies. So you had faith rooted in the numinous, standing up against ideologies separated from transcendent truth. And so I never ask. I get offended sometimes when people will say, oh, why do you care so much about the Uyghur? They're Muslims. I'm like, it horrifies me even to hear that. Or if I'm in Iraq and someone tells me you can't eat with them, they're Yazidi, I'll eat off their plate. I think my Yazidi friends either think I'm a humanitarian or very rude, because I make it a point of eating off their plate and sharing off of my plate. I don't ask these questions. They're precious, they're beautiful. And that's our mission, to just tell that simple, simple truth.
It's interesting because, and I've talked about this on my show quite a bit, the rebranding or redefinition of the word tolerance and what acceptance is. Because and hear me out, I think in society these days, when people say tolerance or acceptance, what they really mean is adherence, the abandonment of your values in order to become, adhering to the values of others. But there's another perspective, which I think you're hitting on, which is that you can keep your values, you can keep your beliefs and still appreciate the value of another person and their values and their beliefs. And that's a more traditional view, I think, of what tolerance is. I'm curious how you view this dynamic of tolerance and acceptance.
Yeah, my friends, I hate when people say, I hear it all the time, people are always shocked, who will put me in a box and they hang out with me, in Hollywood or wherever. They go, your friends are so diverse. You know, I throw these legendary parties in Hollywood, but they're small, maybe 20, 30 people, but, you know, you'll have every label there that, you know, but I don't go seeking labels to prove I'm a good person. It's just, they're my friends and they're beautiful people and they're the ones I want to hang out with when I'm there. And so we all come together. And I'm like, well, they're really not different at all. You're looking at the labels and their faith or whatever they identify with. I don't see that. I just see people that are really tolerant. I am like a Catholic. I love my faith. I live my faith. If you walked into my house, you'd think you're walking into an Orthodox monastery with all of the icons and my wife streaming in, you know, Catholic music. And if you looked at our bookshelves, I have all the writings of the church fathers and Aquinas' Summa. I'm a Catholic. But of course, there's nothing to me more beautiful, which my faith teaches me, by the way, than people reaching for God, reaching for the numinous. And my faith informs my beliefs, but it is informed through revelation, through revealed religion that is not accessible through logic. Only I would have to deny others, you know, people's free will. Like people that they don't accept a revealed religion to me shouldn't be offensive. You shouldn't at face value accept any revealed religion, but I'm not going to walk around with that coexist mentality either, because what that says is I'm saying that all of it is false, right? They're all equally false. To me, that's what that bumper sticker, that tolerance you're talking about really means. They're all equally false. What I say is they all have most of the truth. I accept that. They all have most of the truth. Ironically, that truth that they all share in common, the person that slaps that bumper sticker on their car, they're separated from. Because I guarantee you, most of the people that put that coexist bumper sticker on their car, you know the bumper sticker I'm talking about?
I know the one.
They're divorced from the numinous, sorrowfully divorced from the great mystery that is this cosmos. And so I think that all those symbols on that bumper sticker, we all do share so much in common. I don't need to tolerate them. I acknowledge we share most things in common, primarily our assent to a truth that transcends reason, that's accessible through reason alone. And we assent to the truth of a law above opinion, above the laws of man, above states and governments. We assent to that truth. And I think most of those traditions would assent to the truth of the inviolable beauty of the human person. So yeah, I don't need to tolerate them. I celebrate them. You know, I would say probably, you know, my closest friends, I'm a Catholic, and my handful of closest friends, they're Muslim. And we're always trying to convert each other, but we love each other, you know.
Now, we're at an interesting, terrible impasse, I think, not only just in this country, but most of the world, which is that when we view the systems in power in China trying to take power here in the United States, it is a system in China especially that persecutes religion. And it doesn't matter what religion you are. And not only that, but establishes state-run versions that alter the religions. You mentioned, for example, the Pope acknowledging the Chinese Communist Party appointing these bishops, for example.
Sorrowful, scandalous.
Yeah. And so what we're facing, I think, is a world right now, the United States, the direction we may be heading in when it comes to socialism and the social justice push to really eliminate traditional values. Is this battle, I think, between whether we have faith in something higher than government. And when we talk about faith and the ability to believe in something higher than government, this establishes the idea that there's a moral standard beyond what the government determines as being moral, beyond political correctness, in the original term from Mao Zedong.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I'm curious, because you've come out and, of course, supported religious liberty. How do you view this conflict the world is in right now when it comes to faith versus, really this forced atheism that communism embodies?
Yeah, what I think is sorrowful is it's not as clear-cut as I shared with you yesterday. I don't think it's as clear-cut as, it's not as clear-cut as it was in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, where you had sort of the East versus the West. You had the free world, and then you had the totalitarian socialists. Here you have a world that's divided through the heart. So you have the neoliberals and the CCP that share a similar worldview that denies the numinous, denies the law above the laws of man, the transcendent moral order, natural law, whatever you want to call it, denies the incomparable beauty of the human person. Our country, the United States of America, is the only country in the history of the world founded on anthropology. It's in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with rights. That is an anthropology, and that is a vision of the human person. The neoliberals deny that vision of the human person. They support posited law. I mean, God forbid, whenever there's a Supreme Court justice nominated, the biggest concern of the left is that they have ever expressed belief in a law above the laws of man, natural law. That's why they went after Bork, Clarence Thomas. This is their great fear. That God forbid a judge on the Supreme Court would acknowledge the law above the legislature. Well, that's the CCP. It's an extreme form. The CCP is not bound by the traditions of the West. They're not, in the Anglo-American political community, we have common law, we have our history, we have the church. Traditionally, which has been there to communicate a belief in a transcendent moral order, I think they're falling flat now. And then, so on the other hand, you have those of us of different faith traditions that want to organize ourselves. Hannah Arendt, who is, I think, just one of the most beautiful human beings in the history of the human family. She was Jewish and she escaped the Nazis. She said, we're living in a world without banisters. We think without banisters now. What is the banister, I think, that unites us against the neoliberals and the CCP? It's a belief in a preferential option for the vulnerable, organizing our communities around the vulnerable, our families, our neighborhoods, our religious communities, our counties and our states and our federal government and the world. We should organize ourselves around the truly vulnerable. You compare this to the CCP and the neoliberals, they organize themselves around the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable. Whether it's the CCP, trafficking the Uyghurs across their country into slave labor camps to make Nike shoes, or whether it's Nike going, they're not a direct supplier. They're not a direct supplier. What does that mean? That means they're an indirect, they're not a direct manufacturer. Oh, they're an indirect manufacturer? What does that mean? You don't have the Nike swoosh on the factory? I don't know what you mean by that. It's the same vision of the human person. It's driven by avarice. It's driven by a thoughtless selfishness. And so that's how the world is divided. A culture of life and a civilization of love on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have these ideologies of evil and a culture of death. That's the choice right now. It's a real axial age. And I'm hopeful. And I think on the other side of this axial age is a culture of life. But the scramble is now. I think if I could take a time machine to any point in the history of the human family, it would be to right now. Because I think there's never been more at stake. I became a father. I lost my first child to an abortion. Had my second child at 18. I'm a high school dropout. Was last in my class in high school before I dropped out. Went into the infantry. I'm not exceptionally bright. I'm not gifted in very many ways, but I was born in this country where somebody like me has had the privilege of running presidential campaigns, publishing books, and making movies. And it's because I was blessed to be born in this country. By the time I was in my late 20s, working my way through college as a young father, I realized that I just want to live the rest of my life for my posterity. I want to make sure others have been as privileged as I have been for my posterity. But now we know that my posterity's destiny is intimately linked with those in the Nuba Mountains, with those in the Nineveh Plains, with those in East Turkestan and Tibet. Our posterity's destiny is intimately linked. And so, is there going to be a culture of life that our posterity together lives in, or will they live in a culture of death?
That's interesting. And a lot of people right now are really worried about the future. The world is on the edge, I think, between freedom and socialism. And really, in my eyes, this election is going to determine which direction the world goes in. You mentioned that if you had a time machine, you can go into any time, you'd go to right now. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
So much is at stake. Look at this election. If Biden is president, he's promised lockdowns for 6 months, for 3 months, for a year. I've heard all these different, he's in different speeches. That we know that this lockdown, our ham-fisted response to the CCP virus, has led to global food shortages. David Beasley today was awarded the Nobel Prize for his heroic work through the World Food Program, working together with USAID. They've done an amazing job. We'll break the world. And we're looking at next year as being biblical. David Beasley just said there'll be biblical famine next year if we continue with these, he said it in a political way, so I'm going to translate it. If we continue with these ham-fisted shutdowns, we're going to see a biblical famine. That's what's at stake. The most vulnerable people in the world starving to death, watching their children fall asleep, not knowing if they're going to wake up, trying to wake up. This is happening all over from Bangladesh to South Africa today. Children are starving to death. There's even food insecurity in the United States of America. That's what's at stake. Imagine all these chicken hawks that are lining up for jobs with Biden. Another regime change war in the Middle East. Can you imagine a regime change war in Syria? You'd have 1 million dead and displaced ethnic and religious minorities. There are satellite images now of crematoriums being built outside of the concentration camps where Uyghurs and other minorities are being held and other prisoners are being held. You know, the death camps in Germany, the concentration camps had death in them until 1942. And in 1943, we saw a dramatic shift. They went from being concentration camps with a lot of death to death camps. Are these concentration camps in China going to go from camps where there's organ harvesting, death, to outright death camps? I think this is all at stake right now. You know, me, where I live, with my family, we're good. One way or the other, we'll find a way to be okay. I'm not worried about that. You know, we are the hegemon. The United States is in a position of privilege, and we're a constitutional republic. That means each citizen is a sovereign. That means each of us has a responsibility for the behavior of our country. And we saw what the withdrawal from Iraq did. You know, ISIS was the JV team, by the way. You know, Obama called them a JV team. They were. The Obama administration allowed a JV team to commit an epic genocides against all, you know, the Kurds, Syrians, Chaldeans, Yazidis, and others. That was the JV team that did that. So that's what's at stake, you know. And I always tell my children, if the future involves concentration camps in this country, by God's grace, my children are in those camps, not in the towers. I said, I pray if there are concentration camps in this country, I pray that my posterity dies inside those camps instead of living on the walls. And in a way, I think as an American, are we living on the walls? With my Apple phone in my pocket, my Nike shoes on my feet? Am I already living on the walls? Sorrowful.
Jason Jones, real pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, brother.